The judge's booming laugh echoed in the silent courtroom, cutting through the tense air like a knife. My father, Robert, who minutes earlier had been leaning back in his chair, smug and victorious, went utterly pale. My mother, Patricia, her designer dress smoothed perfectly, froze, her triumphant smile vanishing. In that moment, I knew their carefully constructed lie was about to shatter into a million pieces. I sat there, watching them, in that Miami-Dade County courtroom. Just moments before, they'd confidently declared to Judge Thompson that the 3 vacation homes in the Florida Keys, worth over $2 million combined, belonged solely to them. Dad looked so proud as he announced I deserved absolutely nothing from my grandmother Dorothy's estate. Mom's smile had been vicious then, as she added that I'd abandoned our family years ago and, therefore, earned 0 inheritance. They truly believed they had won. But Judge Thompson was holding my unopened envelope, the one I'd given him earlier. It contained the irrefutable truth that would expose their fraud. As his fingers broke the seal, my heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of anticipation and dread. This single letter, this piece of paper, was about to lay bare all their deceit. I never imagined I'd be in a courthouse, facing my own parents like this. This nightmare began 6 months earlier, when my beloved grandmother Dorothy passed away peacefully in her homestead apartment on a rainy Tuesday in March. For 3 exhausting, yet incredibly precious years, I had been her primary caregiver. My parents, they lived their comfortable life in Denver, visiting maybe twice a year, calling only on holidays. Dorothy Thompson was 84, and sharp as a tack right up until her final week. She had practically raised me, certainly more than my own parents ever did, especially after my messy divorce 2 years prior. When the doctor told me she only had days left, I took emergency leave from my job as a pediatric nurse at Jackson Memorial Hospital to be by her bedside, around the clock. We spent those last, sacred hours talking about her life, her regrets, and her hopes for my future. The funeral was small and dignified, held at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Homestead. I arranged everything myself, because my parents claimed they were simply too grief-stricken to handle the details. That should have been my first warning sign, a tiny flicker of unease in the overwhelming fog of my sorrow. Robert and Patricia arrived from Denver the night before the service, bringing with them an expensive-looking attorney named Bradley Hoffman, who carried a polished leather briefcase and wore a suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. During the reception, while I was accepting condolences from Dorothy's neighbors and friends, I noticed my parents huddled in whispered conversations with their lawyer. They kept glancing in my direction with expressions I couldn't quite interpret. Something felt wrong, but my grief clouded my judgment, and I just assumed they were discussing funeral expenses or burial arrangements. The real shock came 3 days later. I met them at Dorothy's apartment, expecting an emotional but collaborative process, a chance to divide her precious memories fairly. Instead, Robert arrived with a folder full of legal documents. Dorothy left everything to us in her will, he announced matter-of-factly, not even looking up from his paperwork. The 3 properties in the Keys belong to your mother and me now. The house in Key West, the condo in Marathon, and the cottage in Key Largo. All of it. I felt the blood drain from my face, a sudden cold rush. That can't be right, Dad. Grandma Dorothy always promised those places would be mine someday. She told me dozens of times that she wanted me to have them because I was the only one who truly cared about her. Patricia laughed coldly, a sound that chilled me to the bone. Your grandmother was getting senile in her final years, Jillian. She said lots of things that didn't make sense. The legal documents are clear. As her son, your father inherited the real estate portfolio. You get her personal belongings and some jewelry. That should be more than enough for someone who only showed up when she needed something. Her accusation hit me like a physical blow. I had sacrificed my social life, my dating prospects, countless weekends, to care for Dorothy. I'd driven her to medical appointments, managed her medications, held her hand through scary procedures. The suggestion that I was somehow opportunistic rather than loving made my chest tighten with a burning rage. I want to see the will, I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. Bradley Hoffman spoke up for the first time, his tone professionally condescending. Miss Thompson, I understand this is difficult, but the estate documents are private family matters. Your parents have graciously decided to share the inheritance details with you, but they are under no legal obligation to provide copies of confidential paperwork. She's family, too. I protested, looking directly at Robert. I have a right to know what Grandma Dorothy actually wrote. My father's expression hardened in a way I had rarely seen during my childhood. You have the right to what we choose to give you, Jillian. If you keep pushing this issue, you might find yourself with nothing at all. Dorothy left those properties to us because we are her direct heirs and because we have the financial stability to maintain them properly. A single nurse living in a rented apartment is hardly equipped to handle 3 luxury vacation homes. The conversation escalated quickly from there. Patricia accused me of trying to manipulate Dorothy during her vulnerable final years. Robert threatened to contest any legal action I might consider. Their lawyer remained silent, but took notes throughout our argument, which made me deeply uncomfortable. As they prepared to leave with boxes of Dorothy's most valuable possessions, I made one final plea. Please, just let me see a copy of the will. That's all I'm asking. I need to know that this is really what she wanted. Robert turned back at the door, his face set in stone. If you pursue this matter legally, Jillian, you will lose more than just an inheritance. You will lose your family completely. Is that really what you want? The threat was clear and painful, but as I stood alone in Dorothy's empty apartment that evening, surrounded by the few personal items they'd left me, something didn't add up. Dorothy had been incredibly specific about her plans for those properties. She had shown me architectural sketches for renovations she wanted me to make. She had discussed rental income projections and maintenance schedules. Most importantly, she had made me promise to use the properties to help families with special needs children, something she was passionate about after volunteering with disabled veterans for decades. That night, unable to sleep, I began examining the documents my parents had shown me more carefully. The will was dated just 2 months before Dorothy's death, which seemed odd since she had always been meticulous about keeping her affairs in order. The signature looked slightly different from other documents I had seen her sign over the years. The witness signatures were from people I didn't recognize, despite knowing most of Dorothy's close friends and associates. The more I studied those papers, the more convinced I became that something was terribly wrong. My parents hadn't just inherited Dorothy's properties through normal legal channels. They had somehow manipulated the situation to ensure I received nothing, and they had done it with a calculated precision that suggested months of planning. The realization that my own parents had potentially defrauded both me and Dorothy's memory filled me with a rage I had never experienced before. But it also gave me something else: determination. If they thought their intimidation tactics would make me back down, they were about to discover just how wrong they could be. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove straight to Dorothy's retirement community in Coral Gables. If I was going to uncover the truth, I needed to start with the people who knew her best during her final months. Dorothy had lived at Sunset Manor for 5 years and had developed close friendships with several residents and staff members. My first stop was Helen Martinez, Dorothy's closest friend and next-door neighbor. Helen, 7 to 9, originally from Cuba, had the kind of sharp memory that made her an excellent witness to recent events. She invited me into her apartment, which was decorated with family photos and smelled wonderfully of Cuban coffee. "I've been waiting for you to come see me," Helen said, gesturing for me to sit on her floral sofa. I was at Dorothy's funeral, but there were too many people to talk privately. "I have things to tell you that your parents will not want you to hear." My pulse quickened. "What kind of things, Mrs. Martinez?" Helen poured me coffee in a delicate china cup and settled into her favorite rocking chair. "Your grandmother was furious with Robert and Patricia for the last 2 years of her life. She said they only called when they needed money and never visited unless they wanted something. She was heartbroken that her own son cared so little about her well-being." This matched my own observations, but I needed more concrete information. Did she ever talk about her will, or her plans for the properties? "Every week, sometimes every day," Helen replied emphatically. Dorothy updated her will in January, just 2 months before she died. She was very proud and excited about it. She told me she was leaving everything to you because you were the only family member who showed genuine love and care. She said the Florida properties would let you build the life you deserved after everything you had been through. My heart began racing. She updated her will in January. Are you absolutely certain about that timing? Helen nodded vigorously. Absolutely certain. I remember because she asked me to be a witness when she signed the papers. Dr. Barnes was there too. We both watched her sign multiple documents in her bedroom on a Saturday afternoon. She was completely alert and made jokes about finally doing something that would shock Robert and Patricia. This was completely different from what my parents had told me. According to their version, Dorothy had written her will months earlier and had left everything to them. Helen's account suggested that Dorothy had deliberately disinherited my parents in favor of giving me the inheritance. Mrs. Martinez, do you remember what happened to those documents after Dorothy signed them? Helen's expression became serious and slightly conspiratorial. She hid them in her bedroom Bible, the big leather one her mother gave her decades ago. Dorothy said she didn't trust banks or lawyers with something so important. She wanted to keep the real will where only family would think to look, but where Robert couldn't find it if he came searching through her papers early. My hand started trembling as the implications hit me. If Helen was telling the truth, then the will my parents had presented was either fake or from an earlier version that Dorothy had deliberately replaced. The real will, the one that left everything to me, might still be hidden somewhere in Dorothy's belongings. Did my parents ever visit during those final months? I asked. Helen scoffed dismissively. Visit? They called twice that I know of, both times asking Dorothy to send them money for various emergencies. A car repair, a medical bill, something always. Dorothy would hang up those calls crying because she realized they only contacted her when they needed financial help. She said it broke her heart to admit that Robert had become a user instead of a son. I spent another hour with Helen, learning details about Dorothy's final months that painted a devastating picture of my parents' neglect. According to Helen, Dorothy had tried repeatedly to connect with Robert and Patricia, sending cards, making phone calls, even offering to pay for them to visit Florida. They had excuses for every invitation, and seemed irritated whenever she tried to maintain regular contact. Before leaving, Helen gave me Dr. Samuel Barnes' contact information. He was Dorothy's primary physician and the second witness to her will signing. She also provided the names of 2 other residents who had heard Dorothy talking excitedly about her inheritance plans for me. My next stop was Dorothy's apartment, which my parents had left largely undisturbed. Aside from removing the most obviously valuable items, her jewelry, her antique furniture, and her collection of first edition books, they had left behind boxes of personal papers, photo albums, and what they probably considered worthless sentimental items. I began searching methodically, starting with Dorothy's bedroom. Her large, leather-bound Bible sat prominently on the nightstand where it had always been. Dorothy read from it every morning and every evening for as long as I could remember. The Bible was thick and heavy, bound in worn brown leather that had darkened with age and constant use. I opened the Bible carefully, flipping through pages filled with Dorothy's handwritten notes and highlighted passages. At first, I found nothing unusual, but as I reached the book of Psalms, several folded papers fell out from between the pages. My heart stopped as I recognized Dorothy's careful handwriting on legal-sized documents. The first paper was titled Last Will and Testament of Dorothy Marie Thompson, dated January 15th of this year. The signature was unmistakably Dorothy's, with a distinctive flourish she always added to the final letter of her name. Below her signature were 2 witness signatures, Helen Martinez and Dr. Samuel Barnes, with their addresses and the date clearly marked. As I read through the will's provisions, tears began streaming down my face. Dorothy had left me not just the 3 Florida properties, but also her entire savings account, her investment portfolio, and her life insurance policy. The will specifically mentioned that she was disinheriting Robert Thompson due to years of neglect and financial exploitation of his elderly mother. She had also included a handwritten note explaining that I was the only family member who had shown genuine love and care during her final years. By the way, if you're still with me, make sure to hit that subscribe button. More unbelievable stories like this are coming. But the most shocking discovery was a second document, a letter addressed to me personally, also in Dorothy's handwriting. The letter detailed her growing awareness that Robert had been manipulating her finances and her fear that he would try to steal her inheritance from me after her death. She had written detailed instructions for me to contact Helen and Dr. Barnes if anything seemed suspicious about the estate proceedings. The letter ended with words that made me sob. "Jillian, you have been more of a daughter to me than Robert was ever a son. You sacrificed your young life to care for an old woman, and you never asked for anything in return except my love. These properties represent my life's work, and I trust you completely to use them wisely and with the same kindness you have always shown me. Do not let Robert and Patricia steal what rightfully belongs to you. Fight for justice, not just for yourself, but for my memory." Sitting alone in Dorothy's bedroom, holding proof that my parent had lied to me and stolen my rightful inheritance, I felt a mixture of vindication and rage that was almost overwhelming. They hadn't just committed fraud. They had betrayed Dorothy's final wishes and tried to gaslight me into believing I was being unreasonable for questioning their story. I carefully photographed every page of the Real will and Dorothy's letter using my phone, then placed the original documents in a manila envelope for safekeeping. I also gathered several other papers that showed Dorothy's mental sharpness in her final weeks, including handwritten grocery lists, appointment reminders, and correspondence with various organizations. Before leaving the apartment, I called Dr. Barnes and scheduled an appointment for the following day. I also researched estate attorneys in the Miami area, looking specifically for someone with experience in inheritance fraud cases. My parents thought they had executed the perfect crime, but they had underestimated both Dorothy's foresight and my determination to honor her wishes. As I drove home that evening, I realized this was about much more than money or property. This was about justice for Dorothy's memory and accountability for my parents' unconscionable behavior. They had manipulated an elderly woman, stolen from her estate, and tried to intimidate me into silence. Now, they were about to discover that their daughter was not as weak or naive as they believed. The real battle was just beginning, but for the first time since Dorothy's funeral, I felt hopeful. Truth has a way of surfacing eventually, and I was going to make sure that Dorothy's final wishes were honored exactly as she had intended. The next morning, I met with Dr. Samuel Barnes at his medical office in South Miami. Dr. Barnes was a soft-spoken man in his 60s who had been Dorothy's physician for over 8 years. He remembered her fondly and was visibly upset when I explained what my parents had done. "Your grandmother was one of my most mentally sharp patients right up until her final week," Dr. Barnes told me, reviewing Dorothy's medical records. "She had no signs of dementia, confusion, or cognitive decline. In fact, she was more alert and engaged than many patients half her age. The will signing I witnessed was completely legitimate. Dorothy knew exactly what she was doing and why she was doing it." Dr. Barnes provided me with copies of Dorothy's medical record from her final 6 months, which clearly documented her mental competency. He also wrote a formal letter stating his professional opinion that Dorothy had been fully capable of making legal decisions when she signed the will in January. "I should mention something else," Dr. Barnes added hesitantly. "About 3 months ago, your father called my office asking detailed questions about your grandmother's mental state. He wanted to know if I thought she was becoming confused or if her judgment might be impaired. I told him absolutely not, that she was as sharp as ever. He seemed disappointed by that answer." This revelation sent chills down my spine. Robert had been laying groundwork for his fraud attempt months in advance, trying to establish grounds for claiming Dorothy was mentally incompetent when she disinherited him. The premeditation made their betrayal even more calculated and cruel. Armed with medical documentation of Dorothy's competency, I contacted Maria Rodriguez, an estate attorney who specialized in inheritance fraud cases. Maria had excellent reviews and a reputation for aggressive advocacy on behalf of defrauded heirs. Her office was located in downtown Miami, and she agreed to meet with me that afternoon for an emergency consultation. Maria was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who listened intently as I explained the situation and presented the evidence I had gathered. She examined Dorothy's authentic will, Helen's witness statement, Dr. Barnes' medical records, and the forged documents my parents had presented. This is a clear case of estate fraud, Maria said without hesitation. Your parents forged a will and are attempting to steal property that legally belongs to you. But I suspect this goes deeper than just document forgery. Let me run some financial investigations before we proceed with legal action. Over the next 2 weeks, Maria's team conducted a thorough analysis of Dorothy's financial accounts and discovered a pattern of abuse that shocked even me. The investigation revealed that Robert and Patricia had convinced Dorothy to give them power of attorney years earlier, claiming they needed it for emergency medical decisions if she ever became incapacitated. Instead of using the power of attorney responsibly, they had systematically withdrawn money from Dorothy's savings account for their personal use. Bank records showed regular transfers of $2,000 to $3,000 every few months, always accompanied by emotional phone calls where Robert claimed to have financial emergencies that required immediate help. The stolen money had funded luxury vacations to Europe and California, a new BMW for Patricia, and expensive home renovations in Denver. During the same period, Dorothy had been carefully budgeting her own expenses and even skipping some medical treatments because she thought she couldn't afford them. They stole over $50,000 from your grandmother over 2 years, Maria explained, showing me the detailed financial analysis. But the most egregious theft occurred just days before her death. Maria presented evidence that was even more disturbing than the systematic financial abuse. 3 days before Dorothy died, while she was heavily medicated and barely conscious in the hospital, Robert had somehow convinced her to sign documents changing her life insurance beneficiary from me to him. Hospital records showed that Dorothy was receiving strong pain medications and was drifting in and out of consciousness during those final days. The nurse's notes indicated she was often confused about where she was and had difficulty recognizing visitors. Yet somehow, Robert claimed she had been alert enough to make major financial decisions about her life insurance policy. This is elder abuse at its worst, Maria said angrily. They manipulated a dying woman for financial gain. We are not just talking about estate fraud anymore. This involves multiple felonies, including forgery, theft, elder abuse, and exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The life insurance policy was worth $125,000 and had originally been designated for me to help cover educational expenses if I decided to pursue advanced nursing degrees. Dorothy had specifically explained this to me several times, saying she wanted to support my career development even after she was gone. Maria also discovered that my parents had been pressuring Dorothy to take out a reverse mortgage on her homestead apartment, which would have given them access to even more of her equity. Fortunately, Dorothy had refused that manipulation, but the attempt showed the breadth of their financial predation. We need to file a comprehensive lawsuit immediately, Maria advised. Every day that passes gives them more time to hide assets or dispose of evidence. I'm also going to recommend that we refer this case to the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. As Maria's team prepared our legal documents, I struggled with the emotional reality of what we were uncovering. These were not strangers who had victimized Dorothy. These were her own son and daughter-in-law, who had systematically abused her trust and stolen from her estate. The betrayal felt personal to me as well, since I had spent 3 years caring for Dorothy while they were actively plotting to steal her money. The hardest part was realizing how alone and vulnerable Dorothy must have felt during her final months. She had reached out repeatedly to Robert and Patricia, hoping for genuine connection and family support. Instead, they had seen her advancing age as an opportunity for financial exploitation. Every phone call, every request for a visit, every expression of love from Dorothy had been met with calculated manipulation designed to maximize their eventual inheritance. But Dorothy had been smarter than they realized. Her decision to hide the real will in her Bible and to document their abuse in her personal letter showed that she understood exactly what was happening. She had protected my inheritance and provided me with the evidence needed to expose their fraud. 2 days before we filed the lawsuit, I made one final attempt to resolve things privately. I called Robert and Patricia, hoping that confronting them with evidence might convince them to retain Dorothy's property voluntarily and avoid the public embarrassment of a court battle. Robert's response was immediate and threatening. "You are making a huge mistake, Jillian. If you pursue this, I will make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are." I will destroy your nursing career and your reputation in this community. You will lose everything, including any chance of having a relationship with your family." His threats only strengthened my resolve. Dorothy had entrusted me with seeking justice, and I was not going to let intimidation tactics stop me from honoring her final wishes. Maria filed our lawsuit the next morning, and we also submitted a formal complaint to the state attorney's office requesting criminal charges. The legal papers detailed every aspect of my parents' fraud and abuse, including a timeline, documentation, financial records, medical evidence, and witness statements. We requested the return of all property, full restitution for stolen funds, punitive damages, and criminal prosecution for their felony actions. When the sheriff served Robert and Patricia with the lawsuit papers at their Denver home, they immediately hired Bradley Hoffman to represent them in civil court. But their criminal exposure was more serious than they realized, and no amount of expensive legal representation could erase the evidence of their systematic elder abuse and estate fraud. As I prepared for what would likely be months of legal battles, I found strength in remembering Dorothy's words: "Fight for justice, not just for yourself, but for my memory." This was no longer about inheritance or money. This was about holding accountable people who had preyed on an elderly woman's love and trust for their own selfish gain. The truth was finally going to come out, and Robert and Patricia were about to face consequences for their cruelty and greed. Before our court date, I decided to make one final attempt to resolve this situation without the public humiliation of a trial. Despite Maria's advice to avoid direct contact with my parents, I felt I owed it to Dorothy's memory to give Robert and Patricia one last chance to do the right thing voluntarily. I flew to Denver on a Thursday morning in June and drove my rental car to their upscale neighborhood in Cherry Creek. Their house was larger than I remembered, with a perfectly manicured lawn and expensive landscaping that clearly cost more than Dorothy's annual living expenses. The new BMW that Patricia had bought with Dorothy's stolen money sat prominently in the driveway. Robert answered the door wearing a golf outfit that probably cost more than most people spend on clothes in 6 months. His expression shifted from surprise to anger when he saw me standing on his doorstep. "What are you doing here, Jillian? I thought I made it clear that you were not welcome in this family anymore." "I came to give you one last opportunity to return what belongs to me and avoid a very public trial," I replied calmly. "I have evidence that Dorothy left everything to me in her real will, and I have proof that you forged documents to steal my inheritance." Robert stepped outside and closed the door behind him, clearly not wanting Patricia to hear our conversation. "You don't know what you're talking about." Dorothy was confused in her final months. She changed her mind about a lot of things. I pulled out copies of the authentic will and handed them to him. "This is Dorothy's real will, dated January 15th, witnessed by Helen Martinez and Dr. Barnes. It leaves everything to me and specifically disinherits you for financial exploitation. I also have bank records showing you stole over $50,000 from her accounts." Robert's face turned pale as he scanned the documents. For a moment, I thought he might actually admit the truth and agree to return the stolen property. Instead, his expression hardened into something I had never seen before, pure rage mixed with desperate calculation. "This is garbage," he said, tearing up the copies and throwing them on his lawn. "You forged these papers because you cannot accept that Dorothy chose family loyalty over your manipulation." His reaction was so over the top that I knew he was panicking. "Dad, I have the original documents, witness statements, medical records, and bank statements. Tearing up copies doesn't change the evidence." "Evidence of what?" "Your ability to forge documents and coach elderly people to lie for you." Robert's voice was rising to a shout. "You think because you spent a few years playing nurse to an old woman that you deserve to inherit property worth millions of dollars. You are delusional." At that moment, Patricia appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of our argument. She was wearing designer workout clothes and jewelry that cost more than my annual salary. Her face showed the same mixture of rage and panic I had seen in Robert. "Why is she here?" Patricia demanded. "I thought you told her to stay away from us." "She's trying to extort money from us with fake legal documents," Robert replied. "She thinks we're going to hand over Dorothy's properties because she has some forged paperwork." I turned to Patricia, hoping she might be more reasonable than Robert. Patricia, I know you both stole Dorothy's money and forged her will. I have proof of everything. I'm giving you one chance to return what rightfully belongs to me before this becomes a public court battle. Patricia's laugh was bitter and cruel. You have always been Dorothy's favorite little princess, haven't you? She gave you everything while treating her actual son like garbage. Do you have any idea what it was like to watch her shower you with attention and money while ignoring her own family? Her words revealed a depth of resentment I had never suspected. Dorothy didn't ignore you. She called you constantly and invited you to visit. You were the ones who were always too busy unless you needed something. Too busy working and building a life while you played the devoted granddaughter when it was convenient. Patricia shot back. Dorothy paid for your nursing school, helped you through your divorce, gave you a car when yours broke down. What did we ever get except lectures about responsibility and criticism about our lifestyle choices? The conversation was escalating beyond anything I had anticipated. Robert stepped closer to me, his expression becoming threatening. You want to know the truth, Jillian? We planned this for 2 years. We knew Dorothy was getting old and that she had valuable property. We made sure we were positioned to inherit everything because we deserved compensation for years of being overlooked in favor of you. I couldn't believe he was actually confessing to premeditated fraud. You planned to steal from your own mother. We planned to claim what should have been ours all along, Patricia interjected. Dorothy owed us for decades of being disappointed in Robert, for constantly comparing him to other people's children, for making us feel like failures while treating you like some kind of saint. Their resentment was deeper and more toxic than I had imagined. This was not just about money. It was about years of perceived slights and jealousy that had festered into criminal behavior. So, you decided to steal from an elderly woman as revenge for your hurt feelings. I asked incredulously. Robert stepped even closer. Close enough that I could smell alcohol on his breath despite it being barely noon. We decided to take control of our own inheritance before Dorothy could give it all away to someone who didn't deserve it. Patricia's voice turned vicious. By forging documents and stealing her money. By doing whatever was necessary to prevent you from manipulating a vulnerable old woman out of property that belonged in the family bloodline. The irony was staggering. They were accusing me of manipulation while admitting to years of calculated fraud and theft. Their sense of entitlement was so complete that they genuinely believed they were victims rather than perpetrators. I'm going to give you one final choice, I said, backing toward my car as Robert continued to move closer. Return the properties and the money you stole, or face the consequences in court and possibly in criminal prosecution. Robert's response was to grab my arm forcefully enough to leave bruises. You are not going anywhere until we settle this. You are going to destroy those fake documents and drop this ridiculous lawsuit, or I am going to make your life so miserable that you will wish you had never been born. I jerked my arm free and ran to my rental car, genuinely afraid that Robert might become physically violent. As I started the engine, Patricia screamed from the driveway. You ungrateful little bitch. After everything this family has done for you, this is how you repay us. You are going to regret crossing us. Driving away from their house, my hands were shaking with a combination of adrenaline and rage. Any lingering doubt I might have had about pursuing legal action had evaporated completely. Robert and Patricia had not only admitted to fraud, they had threatened me physically and made it clear they felt completely justified in their criminal behavior. Their sense of entitlement and complete lack of remorse showed me that they would never voluntarily retain Dorothy's property or acknowledge the harm they had caused. They viewed themselves as victims of Dorothy's favoritism toward me rather than as adults who had chosen to neglect their elderly mother and then steal from her estate. The flight back to Miami gave me time to process what had happened and to prepare mentally for the court battle ahead. Robert and Patricia had shown their true character, and now it was time for them to face the legal consequences of their choices. Dorothy had been right to disinherit them. They had proven themselves unworthy of her love, her trust, and her legacy. Now it was up to me to make sure that justice prevailed and that Dorothy's final wishes were honored despite their attempts to subvert them. The trial began on a sweltering Monday morning in August at the Miami-Dade County Courthouse. Judge William Thompson's courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with dark wood paneling and fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows across the rows of benches. I sat with Maria Rodriguez at the plaintiff's table, trying to calm my nerves as we reviewed our opening strategy one final time. Robert and Patricia entered the courtroom looking like they were attending a country club event rather than facing fraud charges. Patricia wore an expensive navy blue dress with matching shoes and carried a designer handbag that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Robert had on a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit with a silk tie and gold cufflinks. Their attorney, Bradley Hoffman, looked equally polished and confident as he arranged his materials at the defense table. Judge Thompson was a distinguished man in his early 60s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had a reputation for being fair but no nonsense, and Maria had warned me that he didn't tolerate dishonesty or manipulation in his courtroom. Bradley Hoffman stood to deliver his opening statement with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to expensive litigation. He painted a picture of Dorothy as an elderly woman whose judgment had become impaired in her final months, making her susceptible to manipulation by a granddaughter who had isolated her from her loving son and daughter-in-law. Dorothy Thompson was vulnerable and alone during her final years, Hoffman argued. My clients, Robert and Patricia Thompson, live in Denver and were unable to visit as frequently as they would have liked due to work obligations and financial constraints. Miss Gillian Thompson took advantage of this geographical separation to insert herself as the primary caregiver and systematically turned Dorothy against her own son. Hoffman's narrative was skillfully crafted but completely false. He claimed that Dorothy had written her will leaving everything to Robert months before her death, when she was still thinking clearly. According to his version, the documents Gillian presented were either forged or represented Dorothy's confused ramblings during her final weeks when she was not mentally competent to make legal decisions. The evidence will show that Dorothy Thompson made a thoughtful and legally binding decision to leave her estate to her son, who had been her faithful supporter for decades. Miss Gillian Thompson's claims of a later, desperate attempt to overturn her grandmother's legitimate wishes through fraudulent documentation. When Maria stood to deliver our opening statement, she took a completely different approach. Rather than making sweeping claims, she methodically outlined the evidence we would present: bank records, medical documentation, witness testimony, and handwriting analysis that would prove Dorothy's authentic will have been replaced with a forgery. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a calculated fraud perpetrated against an elderly woman by her own son and daughter-in-law. She was an attorney and then forged documents to steal an inheritance that rightfully belonged to the plaintiff. Maria's tone was calm and factual, which made her accusations even more powerful. The second day of trial began with an atmosphere of tension that was almost suffocating. Judge Thompson entered the courtroom carrying a large folder and wearing the expression of someone who had spent considerable time analyzing evidence overnight. My parents sat rigidly at the defense table, and I noticed that Patricia's hands were trembling slightly as she pretended to review documents. Judge Thompson addressed the courtroom before testimony resumed. After examining the will documents presented by the defense, I have some questions that need to be answered before we proceed. Mr. Hoffman, I would like you to call Robert Thompson back to the witness stand. Robert looked pale but confident as he took his oath again. He clearly believed that his polished demeanor and expensive legal representation would carry him through any challenges to his story. Judge Thompson opened the folder and removed several documents. Mr. Thompson, you have testified that your mother signed this will, leaving you her entire estate. You have also testified that she did this because she trusted you to handle her affairs responsibly. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. My mother knew that Patricia and I had the financial stability and experience to manage her properties properly. Judge Thompson nodded and then dropped a bombshell that changed everything. Mr. Thompson, I personally knew your mother for over 30 years. We served together on the board of the Veteran Support Foundation, and I was familiar with her handwriting from countless documents she signed during that time. The signature on this will is not your mother's authentic signature. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Bradley Hoffman looked like he had been hit by a truck while Robert's face went completely white. Your Honor, Hoffman protested, while we respect your personal relationship with Mrs. Thompson, handwriting analysis should be conducted by professional experts rather than personal observation. Judge Thompson's expression was stern. Mr. Hoffman, I am not making a legal ruling based on personal observation. I ordered professional handwriting analysis last night, and the results confirmed that this signature was forged. The authentic signature shows completely different pen pressure, letter formation, and stroke patterns than your client's document. Maria had arranged for handwriting analysis as part of our case preparation, but having Judge Thompson independently reach the same conclusion was devastating for my parents' defense. Furthermore, Judge Thompson continued, I have some questions about witness signatures on this document. Mr. Thompson, can you tell me who witnessed your mother signing this will? Robert consulted with his attorney before answering. Two of my mother's neighbors at the retirement community. I believe their names are listed on the document. Judge Thompson examined the will again. The witnesses listed are James Mitchell and Sarah Williams. My staff contacted the Sunset Manor retirement community this morning. There has never been a resident named James Mitchell at that facility. Sarah Williams moved to Ohio 18 months ago and has been contacted by investigators. She states that she never witnessed your mother signing any legal documents and that her signature on this will is a forgery. The revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Not only had Robert forged Dorothy's signature, but he had also forged the witness signatures required for a valid will. This was not a simple family dispute over inheritance. This was systematic document fraud. Bradley Hoffman requested a brief recess to consult with his clients, and I could see him having a heated, whispered conversation with Robert and Patricia. When court resumed, Hoffman's strategy had completely changed. Your Honor, my clients would like to withdraw their previous testimony and enter a plea of no contest to the civil charges. They are prepared to return all property and make full financial restitution to Ms. Thompson. But Judge Thompson was not finished exposing the depth of their fraud. Mr. Hoffman, I appreciate your client's willingness to cooperate, but we need to complete the evidentiary record for potential criminal referral. Ms. Rodriguez, please present your remaining evidence. Maria stood with a stack of documents that represented weeks of investigation. Your Honor, we have evidence that goes far beyond simple will forgery. The defendants engaged in systematic elder abuse, financial exploitation, and fraud over a period of more than 2 years. The first piece of evidence Maria presented was airline and hotel records that she had obtained through subpoena. The records proved that during 3 separate occasions when Robert and Patricia had claimed to be visiting Dorothy in Florida, they were actually vacationing in Las Vegas and California using Dorothy's stolen money. These records show that on March 15th through 18th, while Mr. Thompson told his mother he was visiting her, he was actually gambling at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. Hotel bills show they spent over $4,000 during this trip, money that was withdrawn from Dorothy Thompson's account just days before. The evidence was displayed on a large screen for the entire courtroom to see. Credit card receipts showed expensive meals, casino gambling, and luxury hotel accommodations, all funded by money stolen from Dorothy's savings. On May 2nd through 6th, while Dorothy Thompson was in the hospital for pneumonia treatment, the defendants told her they could not visit because of work obligations. Travel records show they were actually in San Francisco on vacation, staying at the Ritz-Carlton and dining at expensive restaurants. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of callous disregard for Dorothy's well-being while she was struggling with health problems and longing for family support. Robert and Patricia were using her money to fund luxury vacations and lying about their whereabouts. The most damning evidence came from phone records that showed the pattern of their manipulation. Dorothy had called Robert repeatedly during her final months, often leaving voicemail messages begging him to visit or at least call her back. The phone log showed that Robert rarely answered her calls and often went weeks without returning her messages. On Dorothy Thompson's final day alive, when she was calling family members to say goodbye, phone records show she attempted to reach Robert Thompson 6 times. He was in Las Vegas during this time period and never answered his phone. Dorothy Thompson died alone because her son chose gambling over spending her final hours with her. The courtroom was completely silent as the full scope of Robert and Patricia's cruelty became clear. They had not just stolen Dorothy's money. They had abandoned her emotionally during the most vulnerable time of her life. Maria presented additional evidence showing that Robert had convinced Dorothy to change her life insurance beneficiary while she was heavily sedated and barely conscious in the hospital. Medical records prove that Dorothy was receiving morphine and other medications that impaired her cognitive abilities when those documents were signed. This represents the most despicable form of elder abuse, Maria stated, taking advantage of a dying woman's medicated state to steal money that was intended for her granddaughter's education. The insurance policy documents were clearly signed by someone with impaired motor control. She promised to present evidence that would prove Dorothy was mentally sharp when she wrote her authentic will, that Robert and Patricia had been neglecting her for years, and that they had planned their inheritance theft well in advance. The first day of testimony began with character witnesses. Helen Martinez took the stand wearing her best dress and speaking with the dignity of someone who had lived through real hardship and understood the difference between right and wrong. She testified about Dorothy's mental sharpness, her excitement about updating her will, and her heartbreak over Robert's neglect. Dorothy was as smart as any person I have ever known, Helen said firmly. She read newspapers every day, did crossword puzzles, balanced her own checkbook, and remembered every detail about her friends and family. When she signed that will in January, she knew exactly what she was doing and why she was doing it. Bradley Hoffman tried to undermine Helen's testimony by suggesting she was motivated by friendship loyalty rather than objective truth. But Helen's responses were so sincere and specific that even he seemed uncomfortable attacking an elderly woman who was clearly telling the truth. Dr. Barnes testified next, presenting Dorothy's medical records and his professional assessment of her cognitive abilities. His testimony was particularly damaging to my parents' case because it provided clinical documentation that Dorothy had no signs of dementia or mental impairment during the time period when they claimed she was confused. In my professional opinion, Dorothy Thompson was fully capable of making legal decisions right up until her final week of life, Dr. Barnes stated clearly. She had no cognitive decline, no confusion, and no signs of the mental impairment that would be necessary to claim she lacked testamentary capacity. When Hoffman cross-examined Dr. Barnes, he tried to suggest that elderly patients could have good days and bad days that might not be captured in medical records. But Dr. Barnes was prepared for this attack and referenced specific examples of Dorothy's mental acuity from multiple appointments during her final months. The afternoon session focused on financial evidence. Maria presented bank records showing the systematic theft of Dorothy's money by Robert and Patricia over a 2-year period. The pattern was so clear and documented so thoroughly that even Hoffman seemed surprised by the extent of their financial abuse. These transfers were not gifts or legitimate financial assistance, Maria explained to the jury. These were unauthorized withdrawals made possible by power of attorney that was obtained through false pretenses and then abused for personal enrichment. The most dramatic moment of the first day came when Maria presented evidence about the life insurance policy changes that Robert had convinced Dorothy to sign during her final days in the hospital. The medical record showed Dorothy was heavily sedated and barely conscious when those papers were signed. This represents elder abuse at its most despicable level, Maria stated, taking advantage of a dying woman's vulnerability to steal money that was intended for her granddaughter's education. Judge Thompson examined the life insurance documents carefully, and I could see his expression grow more serious as he reviewed the timeline. When he looked up at Robert, his disapproval was obvious, even though he maintained judicial neutrality. The first day ended with Hoffman calling Robert to testify on his own behalf. Robert took the stand with confidence, presenting himself as a loving son who had been unfairly accused by a vindictive granddaughter. He testified that Dorothy had always intended to leave her estate to him as her direct heir, and that all financial transactions had been legitimate gifts or assistance requests from Dorothy herself. My mother was generous with her money throughout her life, Robert testified. When she offered to help us with expenses or emergencies, we accepted gratefully because that was her way of showing love to her family. Robert's testimony was smooth and well-rehearsed, but Maria was prepared for his lies. When she cross-examined him, she began by asking simple questions about his visits to Dorothy and his phone calls with her during her final year. How many times did you visit your mother in Florida during her final year of life? Robert hesitated, clearly not expecting such a direct question. Several times. I cannot give you exact dates without checking my calendar. Maria presented airline records that she had subpoenaed. According to these records, You flew to Florida exactly twice in the year before your mother's death. Both visits lasted less than 48 hours. Is that your definition of being a loving and attentive son? The courtroom was silent as Robert struggled to explain why he had visited his dying mother only twice while I was providing daily care. His answers became defensive and contradictory, making him look exactly like what he was, a neglectful son who was lying to justify stealing his mother's money. But the real shock came when Judge Thompson interrupted the cross-examination with an unexpected question. Mr. Thompson, may I examine the will documents that form the basis of your inheritance claim? Huffman handed the forged will to the judge, who studied it carefully for several long minutes. The courtroom was completely quiet as Judge Thompson examined the signature and witness information. Finally, Judge Thompson looked up with an expression that sent chills through my parents' legal team. "This is very interesting," he said quietly. "I knew Dorothy Thompson personally for over 30 years through various charity organizations in South Florida. I'm quite familiar with her handwriting." The color drained from Robert's face as the implications became clear. Judge Thompson was not just reviewing the case objectively. He had personal knowledge of Dorothy and could identify forgeries based on his own experience with her authentic writing. "We will continue this examination tomorrow," Judge Thompson announced. "Court is adjourned." As we left the courthouse that evening, Maria was cautiously optimistic about our progress. But I could see that my parents were beginning to panic. Their confident facade was cracking as they realized that their carefully planned fraud was being exposed piece by piece. The real fireworks would come the next day, when Judge Thompson revealed exactly what he had discovered about their forged documents. Dorothy's normally neat signature was shaky and incomplete, showing that she was not in any condition to make financial decisions. Judge Thompson examined each piece of evidence carefully, and his expression grew more disapproving with every revelation. When Maria finished presenting the evidence, he addressed my parents directly. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, I have been on this bench for 22 years, and I have rarely seen such systematic and callous elder abuse. You manipulated a vulnerable elderly woman, stole her money, abandoned her emotionally, and then attempted to defraud her estate through document forgery. Your behavior represents a level of greed and cruelty that is both shocking and unconscionable." Patricia began crying, but whether from remorse or fear of consequences was unclear. Robert sat silently, apparently realizing that their situation was hopeless. Bradley Hoffman stood to address the court. "Your Honor, my clients acknowledge their mistakes and are prepared to make full restitution. They request the court's mercy in resolving this matter civilly rather than pursuing criminal charges." But Judge Thompson's expression made it clear that mercy was not something he was inclined to offer. "Mr. Hoffman, this case involves multiple felonies, including forgery, theft, elder abuse, and exploitation of a vulnerable adult. I am required to refer this matter to the State Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution, regardless of any civil settlement." The revelation that criminal charges were inevitable hit my parents like a physical blow. Patricia's crying became louder, and Robert finally showed the first signs of genuine panic. Maria concluded our presentation by reading portions of Dorothy's personal letter that explained her reasoning for disinheriting Robert and leaving everything to me. Dorothy's words, from beyond the grave, were a powerful testament to the love and care I had shown her versus the neglect and exploitation she had suffered from her own son. As the court session ended, Judge Thompson announced that he would issue his ruling the following morning. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The evidence of fraud and elder abuse was overwhelming, and my parents' lies had been exposed completely. Walking out of the courthouse that evening, I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. Justice was finally going to be served, but the process had revealed just how cruel and selfish my parents truly were. Dorothy had been right to protect her estate from their greed, and now her wishes were going to be honored exactly as she had intended. The final day of trial arrived with the weight of inevitability. Judge Thompson entered his courtroom that Friday morning, carrying a thick folder of legal documents and wearing the expression of someone who had spent considerable time crafting a comprehensive ruling. The gallery was fuller than it had been during the previous sessions, with several local reporters present to cover what had become a notable case of family fraud and elder abuse. Robert and Patricia sat at the defense table looking defeated and frightened. Patricia clutched a tissue box and kept glancing nervously toward the exit, as if considering whether she could somehow escape the consequences that were about to be delivered. Robert stared straight ahead with the hollow expression of someone who finally understood that his carefully planned crime had failed completely. Judge Thompson began his ruling by addressing the evidence that had been presented during the trial. His voice was measured, but carried an underlying current of controlled anger that made every word feel significant. In over 2 decades on this bench, I have presided over numerous estate disputes, many involving family members who disagree about inheritance matters. However, this case represents something far more serious than a typical inheritance disagreement. The evidence presented in this courtroom reveals a pattern of elder abuse, financial exploitation, and systematic fraud that shocks the conscience. Judge Thompson methodically reviewed each aspect of the case, starting with the forged will and the fake witness signatures. He explained that professional handwriting analysis had confirmed that Dorothy's signature was forged and that the witnesses listed on the document had either never existed or never been present when the supposed will was signed. The defendants engaged in sophisticated document forgery in an attempt to steal property worth over $2 million from the rightful heir. This was not a spontaneous crime of opportunity, but rather a premeditated fraud that required months of planning and preparation. The judge then addressed the financial abuse that Robert and Patricia had perpetrated against Dorothy during her final years. He noted that the systematic theft of over $50,000 from Dorothy's accounts represented a violation of the trust she had placed in them when granting power of attorney privileges. Dorothy Thompson gave her son power of attorney, believing that he would use this authority to protect her interests if she became unable to manage her own affairs. Instead, Robert Thompson used this power to systematically steal money from his elderly mother for luxury vacations, expensive purchases, and personal enrichment. This represents a profound betrayal of fiduciary duty and constitutes criminal elder abuse. Judge Thompson's analysis of the life insurance manipulation was particularly scathing. He noted that convincing a heavily medicated dying woman to change her beneficiary designations represented exploitation of a vulnerable adult at the most despicable level. The evidence shows that Dorothy Thompson was receiving powerful pain medications and was drifting in and out of consciousness when Robert Thompson convinced her to sign documents changing her life insurance beneficiary. Medical records clearly indicate that Dorothy was not in any condition to make informed financial decisions during this time period. This behavior represents elder abuse of the most callous and unconscionable nature. The judge then addressed the authentic will that Dorothy had hidden in her Bible and the personal letter she had written explaining her decision to disinherit Robert in favor of leaving everything to me. Dorothy Thompson was mentally sharp and fully capable of making legal decisions when she wrote her authentic will in January. The evidence proves conclusively that she intended to leave her entire estate to her granddaughter, Gillian Thompson, who had provided loving care during Dorothy's final years, while her son and daughter-in-law neglected her emotional and physical needs. Judge Thompson's ruling was comprehensive and unambiguous. He ordered Robert and Patricia to immediately transfer all property titles to me, including the 3 Florida vacation homes and all associated assets. He also ordered them to pay full restitution for the money they had stolen from Dorothy's accounts, plus additional damages totaling $400,000 for their fraudulent actions. The defendants will pay all attorney fees and court costs associated with this litigation. They are permanently enjoined from challenging this ruling or attempting to claim any portion of Dorothy Thompson's estate in the future. But Judge Thompson was not finished delivering consequences. He announced that he was referring the case to the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution on charges including forgery, theft, elder abuse, exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and perjury. The criminal behavior documented in this case cannot be resolved through civil remedies alone. The defendant's actions warrant criminal prosecution to ensure accountability and to deter similar crimes against elderly victims. The judge also issued a restraining order prohibiting Robert and Patricia from contacting me directly or indirectly, and he ordered them to have no involvement in the management or disposition of any property that had belonged to Dorothy. As Judge Thompson concluded his ruling, Patricia broke down completely, sobbing loudly enough that court security had to escort her from the courtroom. Robert sat in stunned silence, apparently unable to process the magnitude of the consequences he was facing. Bradley Hoffman attempted to request time for an appeal, but Judge Thompson denied the motion, noting that the evidence of fraud was so overwhelming that any appeal would be frivolous and without merit. The defendants engaged in systematic criminal behavior over a period of years. The evidence of their guilt is conclusive and undeniable. This court will not entertain dilatory tactics designed to delay justice for the victim of their crimes. When the formal proceedings concluded, Maria and I met with a representative from the state attorney's office who explained that criminal charges would be filed within the next week. They indicated that the evidence was so strong that plea negotiations would likely focus on prison sentences rather than probation. In the weeks following the trial, the full scope of justice began to unfold. Robert and Patricia were both indicted on multiple felony charges and eventually plea bargained to prison sentences of 18 months each. They were also required to pay substantial fines and were permanently barred from serving as guardians or holding power of attorney for any elderly persons. The property transfers were completed within 30 days of the court ruling. I became the rightful owner of Dorothy's 3 beautiful vacation homes in the Florida Keys, along with her investment accounts and life insurance proceeds. The total inheritance was worth approximately $2.3 million, exactly as Dorothy had intended when she wrote her authentic will. But for me, the financial windfall was less important than the sense of justice and closure. Dorothy's final wishes had been honored despite my parents' attempts to subvert them through fraud and manipulation. Her memory had been vindicated, and her trust in me had been validated by the legal system. 6 months after the trial concluded, I made a decision that I believe would have made Dorothy proud. I renovated the largest of the 3 properties in Key West, transforming it into a vacation rental facility specifically designed for families with special needs children. The house was equipped with wheelchair accessibility, sensor-friendly spaces, and specialized equipment that made it possible for families dealing with disabilities to enjoy a Florida vacation they might not otherwise be able to afford. The second property in Marathon became my personal retreat, a place where I could escape from the demands of my nursing career and remember the woman who had shaped my values and supported my dreams. I kept Dorothy's furniture and personal belongings in this house, creating a living memorial to her kindness and wisdom. The third property in Key Largo was sold, and the proceeds were used to establish the Dorothy Thompson Scholarship Fund for nursing students from low-income families. The scholarship provided full tuition assistance for students who demonstrated both academic excellence and a commitment to serving vulnerable populations. Dorothy's investment accounts and life insurance proceeds allowed me to expand these charitable activities and to pursue advanced degrees in pediatric nursing without financial stress. Every decision I made about using Dorothy's inheritance was guided by the values she had taught me: compassion, service to others, and the responsibility to use privilege for the benefit of those who are less fortunate. 1 year after the trial, while organizing Dorothy's personal papers, I discovered a final letter that she had hidden in a different part of her Bible. The letter was addressed to me and dated just 1 week before her death. In it, Dorothy expressed complete confidence that I would always make the right choices about how to use whatever inheritance she left me. Jillian, she wrote in her careful handwriting, I know that you will honor my memory, not through how much money you inherit, but through how you use whatever resources I am able to leave you. You have already shown me more love and care than I had any right to expect, and I trust completely that you will continue to make choices that reflect the values we have shared together. Use these properties and this money to build the life you deserve. But never forget that the greatest inheritance I can give you is the knowledge that you are loved unconditionally and that you have the strength to overcome any challenge that life presents to you. Dorothy's letter ended with words that became my guiding principle. Stand up for what is right, not because it is easy, but because justice and truth matter more than comfort or convenience. The people who try to silence you through intimidation or manipulation are afraid of your strength. Never let their fear prevent you from doing what you know is correct. Reading those words 1 year later, I realized that Dorothy had known exactly what would happen after her death. She had anticipated that Robert and Patricia would try to steal her inheritance, and she had prepared me emotionally and practically to fight for justice. Her decision to hide the authentic will and to document their abuse had given me the tools I needed to expose their fraud and reclaim what rightfully belonged to me. The experience taught me that family is defined not by blood relationships, but by genuine love, care, and mutual support. Robert and Patricia had shared DNA with Dorothy, but they had never shown her the respect, affection, and attention that defines true family bonds. Their sense of entitlement to her property was based on genetics rather than relationship, and their willingness to steal from her proved that they had never understood what family actually means. In contrast, Dorothy and I had built a relationship based on mutual love, shared values, and genuine care for each other's well-being. The inheritance she left me was not just financial. It was also emotional and spiritual. She had taught me to stand up for justice, to care for vulnerable people, and to use whatever resources I had to make the world a little bit better. Today, as I watch families with special needs children enjoying vacations at Dorothy's Key West property, I know that her legacy is being honored in exactly the way she would have wanted. The scholarship recipients who are pursuing nursing careers with financial support from her estate are carrying forward her commitment to service and compassion. Sometimes I receive updates about Robert and Patricia through mutual acquaintances. They served their prison sentences and were released with probation restrictions and massive debt from legal fees and restitution payments. Their comfortable lifestyle in Denver is gone, and they struggle financially while dealing with the social shame of their criminal convictions. I feel no satisfaction from their suffering, but I also feel no sympathy. They made choices that hurt a vulnerable elderly woman who loved them unconditionally. They chose greed over family, deception over honesty, and cruelty over compassion. The consequences they face are the natural result of their own actions. The greatest lesson I learned from this experience is that truth and justice do eventually prevail, but only if someone is willing to fight for them. Dorothy trusted me to seek justice, not just for my own sake, but for the sake of her memory and values. Standing up to intimidation and fraud was difficult and emotionally painful, but it was also necessary and ultimately rewarding. Dorothy's inheritance gave me financial security, but more importantly, it gave me a deeper understanding of my own strength and values. I learned that I was capable of fighting for what was right, even when facing opposition from people I had once trusted and loved. I discovered that doing the right thing often requires courage, persistence, and a willingness to endure temporary hardship for the sake of long-term justice. As I continue my nursing career and manage Dorothy's charitable legacy, I carry with me the knowledge that she believed in my character and trusted me completely with her life's work. That trust is both humbling and empowering, reminding me daily that every choice I make should reflect the value she taught me and the love she showed me. Dorothy Thompson may be gone, but her influence continues through the lives she touches via the vacation rental facility, the scholarship program, and the example she set for standing up to injustice. Her authentic will was more than a legal document. It was a final act of love and faith that continues to change lives years after her death. The court battle that began with forged documents and family betrayal ended with justice served and a legacy preserved. Sometimes the hardest fights are the most important ones. And sometimes the greatest inheritance is the knowledge that someone believed in you enough to trust you with their dreams. Have you ever had to stand up for what was right, even when it meant confronting people you loved? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to know.